Well, Queenslanders go to the polls this Saturday in what is shaping as a fascinating election. Political correspondent James Massola is in Brisbane. James, good morning.
Good morning, Chris.
This election is looking like it might be remarkably close.
Yeah, look, that's right. Campbell Newman and the LNP obviously had a record-breaking win in 2012. They've lost a couple of seats in by-elections since then, but they enjoy a 73-seat-to-9 lead over Labor, or majority over Labor, if you like, in an 89-seat parliament. Now, the showing and sort of internal pundits from both sides are suggesting the LNP will lose somewhere between 15 and 25 seats. Some estimates put it as high as 30. The really interesting contest of course, is Campbell Newman's own seat of Ashgrove. Now, there needs to be a uniform swing of 11.8% across the state for Labor to win back government. That's fairly unlikely, but Newman only has to lose. Newman has a margin of 5.7%, and he's currently trailing, according to a ReachTel poll conducted on Wednesday night, 46-54. So there's a very real prospect that the LNP will get back into government, but that the Premier will lose his seat.
So Campbell Newman and other members of his government have been saying that, look, if he loses, the government will lose. If the government wins, he'll win. Does anyone actually believe that?
No, look, that's been the consistent line through the campaign from people like like Campbell Newman, like Tim Nicholls, the Treasurer. Behind the scenes, though, there are calculations going on. There are discussions going on. The three men most likely to replace Newman, if he does, are Tim Nicholls, the Treasurer, Lawrence Springborg, the Health Minister, and John Paul Langbrook, the Education Minister. The last two, of course, are former leaders of the party, but Campbell Newman's put a pretty brave face on things so far. Chris, he just doesn't want to entertain the idea of losing his seat, basically.
Now, this big swing to Labor, as you say, probably not enough to win government, but a massive swing anyway. Why is that? Why is that happening, and how much can be attributed to the leadership of Anastasia Palaszczuk?
Look, to be honest, I don't think much can be attributed to the leadership of Anastasia Palaszczuk. Newman, as I mentioned before, came in with a thumping majority and took some really tough decisions. He's sort of cracked down on bikies. I think that's generally been popular, but the other decisions he's made, such as cuts to the public service and other services and health and education, a big stoush he had with the judiciary, which sort of culminated mid last year when he named Tim Carmody as the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. The legal fraternity was so up in arms they didn't even attend the swearing-in ceremony of Carmody. These sorts of things have given Queenslanders the sense that Newman is a bit of a crash or crash through politician. He doesn't sort of care what voters think, and he's paid for it. He said a couple of massive losses at by-elections, and to kind of limit that damage and to reset the government around July last year, they being the LNP government, introduced something what they essentially termed Operation Boring, which was to kind of rein in the Premier's abrasive all-action style. And to some extent, I think it's limited the damage and reduced the unpopularity of the Newman government. But as I say, they are facing big swings against them at this poll.
The sense I'm getting from you, James, is that there'd be quite a few Queenslanders who would be quite happy with the result that saw the LNP returned, but Campbell Newman himself kicked out.
Yeah, look, I think that's right. There are even, I think, whisper it, people in Newman's own party who'd be fairly happy with that result. He is a strong leader. He, in some ways, is quite like Tony Abbott, and in some ways he's sort of taken Jeff Kennett's 1992 template or 92-93 template from Victoria, where he's made tough decisions early and gambled that people, that he can spend a bit of electoral capital and that people ultimately will reward his government. Now, I think that's going to happen. I think the LNP are going to get back. But Newman, I would say, doesn't have the kind of charisma that Kennett has and the sort of likeability that Kennett had when he was leader. I mean, he wasn't loved by everyone, but he was liked by more people than Newman were, and that's ultimately what might cost him his seat. Now,
back to Anastasia Palaszczuk. She's been making gas, but Campbell Newman hasn't been actually, his copybook isn't perfect either.
Yeah, that's right. It's the final day of the campaign. There's a leaders' debate at the Queensland Press Club around noon today, 1 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And we're at that, I guess, that kind of ragged edge, if you like. Palaszczuk yesterday on an FM radio interview was sort of thrown 10 quick questions and was unable to name the rate of the GST, which for an opposition leader is, I think personally, a fairly catastrophic mistake. Newman, for his part, however, this morning on the same radio station was thrown a sort of similar 10 questions, and his little gaffe was an inability to spell Ms. Palaszczuk's name. Now, for the record, it's Palaszczuk.
You're running for office, James.
yeah, indeed, I've been practicing, but Mr. Newman was unable to spell it, so a little bit embarrassing. Probably not quite as bad as not knowing what the rate of the GST is, which of course has been 10% since it was introduced. It hasn't changed, despite what some of the federal backbenchers in the coalition are pushing for. And look, I think the point for me with that gaffe from Palaszczuk is it goes to economic credibility. Labor has a really small team. They will, obviously be able to rebuild if as expected, they win 15, 20 seats. But, they just don't quite look ready to govern yet, I think.
Now, James, federal implications. The federal government is under pressure at the moment, no doubt about that. Everyone will be looking at Queensland, spinning lines, if you like, out of the result. But what do you think the actual implications are?
Look, to some extent, I think Tony Abbott is going to be blamed for some of the blowback against Newman, whatever happens, Chris. We saw that after the Victorian campaign. We've seen that with South Australian by-elections. Queensland MPs, federal Queensland MPs, that is, are going to try perhaps and argue that, state issues, federal issues, they're always separate. Bill Shorten, on the other hand, he's been up here 11 times in a 25-day campaign, and most of his shadow ministers have been too. He's going to be arguing that, Campbell, Newman and Tony Abbott are two peas in a pod, that there are big federal implications for the federal government from this campaign when, as I say, Newman loses, a swag of seats.
Will it be? Will the thinking amongst Liberal backbenchers be, "Hey, look, this is what happens if you stick with a leader who's, losing popularity with the electorate"? I'm
sure it'll give them pause for thought. And look, I think it's probably reasonable to assert, as Shorten has, that federal issues have played some part in the campaign. Newman himself acknowledged that earlier this week when, after Tony Abbott announced Prince Philip's knighthood, he was quizzed, I think, several days in a row, and eventually he kind of gave not a blast to the PM, but he did say, look, he'd rather it hadn't happened, he'd rather the knighthood hadn't been announced for Prince Philip. And I think I saw, reading between the lines on that one, I think that's him acknowledging that, what's happening, what's playing out in Canberra is having some impact in Queensland. And again, looking at the sort of election advertising that's around today, the LNP, one of the points they're making is sort of stop the chaos in one of the ads, which is essentially a picture of Palaszczuk, Clive Palmer, Bob Katter and Christine Milne all sort of grouped together and driving home that point about, we don't want a minority government, we don't want crossbenchers running this show. Now, really, that's a point that goes to what happened in the federal parliament from 2010 to 2013. 3 of those 4 people are actually federal MPs, not state MPs. So, again, I think in some ways you see the LNP tacitly acknowledging that federal issues are a factor here.
Okay, James Massola in Brisbane, thanks for your time.
Pleasure to chat, Chris. Thank you.